was in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. We're talking about the Beatles now.
Like one another.
We didn't get along. I've always been in bands, joined bands. I was trying to put this band together.
Ringo Starr, a name once considered the most forgettable among the Fab Four of the Beatles, a quiet drummer, not a principal songwriter, rarely a lead singer, and always tucked behind the drum kit in every iconic photo. Yet there's a paradox that time refuses to deny. The one who was once seen as the weakest Beatle is now the last one standing, still lucid, still joyful, and still making music at the age of 84. Ringo was not a born genius like Lennon, nor as romantic as Paul, nor as profound as George. He didn't shock the world, didn't create major scandals, didn't make grand declarations. But for 6 decades, he kept the beat, not just for the Beatles, but for himself. He endured a childhood of illness and poverty, weathered the emptiness of the post-Beatles era, battled addiction, confusion, and dismissal, only to quietly resurrect himself through a life of sobriety, wellness, and deep love. The world once looked at him with skepticism, then pity, and finally, admiration. Because Ringo's journey was never one of dazzling light. It was the journey of a flame that never went out. A man who didn't need to shine to be great. The story of Ringo Starr is a story of resilience, of a drumbeat that may seem simple, but echoes through the memory of generations. Not because it was flashy, but because it was genuine. And perhaps that, above all, is the hardest thing to hold on to in a world built on fame. Early life. Ringo Starr was born Richard Starkey on July 7, 1940, in Dingle, a poor riverside neighborhood in Liverpool, at a time when England was engulfed in the bombs and chaos of World War II. His childhood had no music, and even less tenderness. When Ringo was just 3 years old, his father, a baker, walked out without a word. From that moment on, little Richard was raised by his single mother Elsie in a cramped, worn-down house with no trace of a man's presence and a constant struggle to make ends meet. The first major blow came when he was 6. A sudden case of acute peritonitis landed him in the hospital in critical condition. He fell into a coma for 3 days and underwent multiple surgeries. The result? Ringo spent more than a year in the hospital, a time when most children are learning their ABCs and playing in the sun. At 13, just when things seemed to stabilize, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. 2 more years slipped away in a sanatorium, this time in Heswall, where he was completely cut off from the outside world. In Ringo's memory, those were years without light, just the smell of disinfectant, the echo of nurses' heels on the corridor floor, and endless cold nights. But it was there that fate tapped its first rhythm. As part of his rehabilitation, hospital staff encouraged him to play drums, not as a musical pursuit, but to help him move his limbs and release mental tension. That frail boy with weak little hands began tapping out rhythms on tabletops, chair arms, whatever would resonate. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had control over something. Ringo never fully returned to school. Too much time in hospitals had left him far behind. He couldn't even read fluently until his teens. But instead of trying to catch up in a system that didn't fit him, he chose to stay with the drums. Every beat he played became an affirmation. Despite illness holding him down, he could still create sound. He could still make something resonate. When Ringo turned 17, the mother who had weathered life's storms alone did something unexpected. She scraped together every bit of savings to buy him a used drum kit. In a tiny room on the 2nd floor, the poor boy with a hunger for music finally had something to call his own. And from that moment on, life found its rhythm. Early career. Before becoming an indispensable part of the Beatles, Ringo Starr was just a name on the margins of a noisy stage. As the drummer for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he played night after night in smoky, chaotic clubs across Liverpool and Hamburg, 8-hour sets for drunken crowds who didn't care who you were. But it was in that very environment that Ringo learned how to keep the beat, not just for the band, but for himself. in the middle of those exhausting, endless nights. These were the years right after he had recovered from his long battle with illness. He had no formal education, no clear future. At that point, Ringo had nothing that made him stand out, except one thing: consistency. In an era where everyone was trying to play louder to get noticed, he chose to play right. In 1960, when Rory Storm shared the bill with an unknown group called the Beatles, Ringo met John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison for the first time. They noticed the way he played, not flashy, not aggressive, but with a rhythm that made the whole room breathe in unison. Though he only filled in for Pete Best during a few gigs, something about his presence lingered in their memory. 2 years later, fate called his name. In August 1962, on the eve of recording an important single, the Beatles, under pressure from producer George Martin, made the decision to replace Pete Best with Ringo Starr. To some, he was a technical upgrade, but to the other three Beatles, he was an emotional choice. The public didn't see it that way. On his very first night performing with the Beatles at Hume Hall, Ringo was booed, had trash thrown at him, and was labeled the seat stealer. Protest graffiti appeared all over Liverpool. Pete forever, Ringo never. He didn't react. He didn't explain. He just sat down, picked up his drumsticks, and hit every beat like he had done it his entire life. A few weeks later, Please Please Me was released, and from that moment, the protest faded into silence. Ringo never needed to prove he was better than anyone. He just needed to make the music feel complete when he was part of it. For the Beatles, that was more than enough. Ringo never fought for the spotlight. He didn't indulge in long solos or overpower his bandmates, but he brought something few drummers had at the time: emotional continuity. He played like telling a story, steady, nuanced, never too much, never too little. And in a band full of geniuses, perhaps it was Ringo's calm that kept them from falling apart too soon. From an outsider, Ringo stepped into the heart of the whirlwind called the Beatles, quietly but decisively. And there he would remain for the next 8 glorious years, keeping the beat that made the whole world listen. Career success. When Ringo Starr officially became the 4th member of the Beatles in August 1962, he didn't just join a band. He stepped into a cultural whirlwind that was about to sweep the world. And strangely enough, in a group as dazzling as Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison, it was Ringo, the quietest one, who held everything together. From Please Please Me, 1963, to Let It Be, 1970, he was present throughout the band's entire studio journey, drumming on all of the era's most iconic recordings. Unpretentious and never flashy, every beat Ringo played served the song perfectly. In Come Together, he seemed to lock in with the soul of the track. In Rain, he defied conventional timing with surprising yet controlled fills. Paul McCartney once admitted, "Ringo was probably the only one of us who never ruined a take." But success was never easy. In 1968, during the recording of the Beatles' The White Album, internal tensions peaked. Lennon and McCartney were growing apart as songwriters. Harrison yearned for recognition, and Ringo, though not at the heart of the conflict, began to feel like an outsider. In a moment of exhaustion and self-doubt, he quietly walked out on the band. No one knew when or if he would return. Then something unexpected happened. When Ringo came back 2 weeks later and stepped into Abbey Road Studios, he found his drum kit covered in flowers, a silent gesture from George and Paul. No apologies, no speeches, just a small act that said, "We need you." From that point on, Ringo stayed with the Beatles until the very end, when they officially disbanded in 1970. As the group fell into legal battles, he was the only one who consistently tried to maintain peace, regularly calling the others in an attempt to keep the breakup from turning bitter. After the Beatles, Ringo embarked on a solo career with a style all his own, lighthearted, upbeat, free from grand ideals. His 1973 album Ringo was a massive success, featuring Photograph, a song he co-wrote with George Harrison that topped the U.S. charts along with You're 16, making him the first Beatle to score a solo #1 single in America. What stood out? Although the band had broken up, all 4 Beatles appeared on Ringo in some form, each contributing separately, as if for a quiet reunion. Perhaps it was Ringo's warmth, ease, and lack of judgment that made them willing to come together again, simply because it was for Ringo. Throughout the 1970s, he continued to release music consistently, acted in films, and though he never reached the solo heights of Lennon or McCartney, he maintained a respected presence, not through noise, but through endurance. In a world where everything can fall out of rhythm, Ringo kept playing in time. Crisis and rebirth. When the Beatles disbanded in 1970, no one seemed to fall into the void as visibly as Ringo Starr. He didn't have Paul's brilliant songwriting career, John's fiery personality, or George's mystical aura. Ringo, the one who kept the beat for others, was suddenly stripped of his role, and the worst part was he didn't know what to do next for himself. He entered the 1970s with a handful of scattered successes in music and film, but as the decade wore on, the spotlight began to fade. Ringo started drinking more, first to relax, then to endure, and finally just to forget. No one really noticed when he began slurring on stage, drifting through interviews, or forgetting the very tracks he had recorded. "I don't even remember making that record," he once admitted during a rare moment of clarity. Cocaine arrived hand in hand with the alcohol, forming a devastating pair. Ringo, once the picture of composure, became erratic, quick-tempered, and withdrew from even his closest friends. His first marriage to Maureen Cox fell apart after repeated infidelities, and he later married Barbara Bach, a beautiful actress who was also battling addiction. The two became a couple lost in endless parties, uncontrolled episodes, and shattered walls no one could explain. Until one night in late 1988, when Ringo, reeking of alcohol, his heart pounding erratically, stood in their Monte Carlo mansion and no longer recognized himself. Barbara was in the same condition, and amid the chaos, one decision was made, simple but life-saving. They would go to rehab, not to save their marriage, not to please anyone, but to survive. Within months, Ringo left the treatment center with a vow. Never again would he touch alcohol or drugs, and he's kept that promise for over 3 decades. But more importantly, he didn't just survive. He came back stronger than ever. In 1989, Ringo formed the Ringo Starr and his All-Starr Band, a supergroup of rock legends who had once soared and stumbled: Joe Walsh, Eagles, Dr. John, Billy Preston, Todd Rundgren. Each played their greatest hits, while Ringo, the host, drummed, sang, and held the rhythm for them all. It wasn't a washed-up star's vanity project. It was a celebration of those who had fallen and learned to rise again. The All-Starr Band has toured almost every year since, performing across more than 30 countries, consistently selling out shows, and earning praise as a model of peaceful, ego-free, inspiring collaboration. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a redefinition of late-life success. No longer about noise or competition, just music and kindness. His rebirth didn't come from a blockbuster album or a Grammy win. It came from waking up each morning and keeping a simple promise: to stay sober, to live cleanly, and to keep playing. Once seen as the least talented Beatle, Ringo became the only one to emerge with his heart intact. And he's still playing, not for fame, because it's simply what he was born to do. Personal life. Behind the stage lights and Ringo Starr's cheerful tunes lies a personal life once riddled with turbulence. The man who kept time for everyone else spent many years unable to keep his own home from falling apart. Ringo married for the first time in 1965, during the height of Beatlemania, to Maureen Cox, his first love from his early drumming days in Liverpool. They had 3 children together: Zach, Jason, and Lee. To the public, they seemed like the most stable Beatle family. but the reality was far different. The marriage between Ringo and Maureen began to crack under the strain of endless tours, fame pulling him away from home, and most damaging of all, his descent into drinking and partying. Ringo admitted to numerous affairs throughout the 1970s. They tried to hold things together for the sake of the children, but in 1975, the marriage ended. In hindsight, Ringo called it the most painful collapse outside of music. Not because she left, but because he knew he was the one who broke it. Their eldest son, Zach Starkey, grew up in the unstable air of a famous family. Though the son of a legendary drummer, Zach largely taught himself, mentored not by his father, but by Keith Moon, Ringo's close friend and the explosive drummer for The Who. For a time, Ringo and Zach were so estranged they didn't speak for months. Ringo was deep in addiction, while Zach struck out on his own, becoming an accomplished drummer without needing the name Starr. Only after Ringo completed rehab did the two begin to mend their relationship. Zach later became the principal drummer for The Who, a quiet declaration that music remained the deepest bond between them. In 1980, Ringo met actress Barbara Bach while filming Caveman. They married a year later, under chaotic circumstances. He was battling alcoholism, she was fighting depression, and both were lost in a haze of endless parties. Yet it was this seemingly fragile relationship that gave Ringo the strength to change. Together, they checked into rehab in 1988 and emerged as a stronger, sober couple. Today, they have been together for over 40 years, one of the rare showbiz marriages that has endured 4 decades. In 1994, Ringo faced another quiet heartbreak. Maureen, his ex-wife and the mother of his children, passed away from leukemia at just 48. Though they had been separated nearly 2 decades, Ringo was at her bedside as she took her last breath. "She was the first person who truly believed in me," he said through tears. Now, with Barbara by his side, grown children, and the old fractures faded into memory, Ringo lives with a rare peace, something he spent many years not knowing where to find. Legacy and influence. Among the millions of music lovers across the world, there are few who haven't bobbed their heads to a Beatles tune. But what most don't realize is this: behind every subtle head nod, every finger tap, every unconscious footstep, was the drumming of Ringo Starr. For years, Ringo was considered the least remarkable of the Beatles. He didn't write many hits, rarely sang lead, never made headlines with bold statements. Critics often dismissed him as the lucky one who happened to stand next to Lennon and McCartney. There's even an infamous joke, whether real or apocryphal, attributed to John Lennon. Ringo isn't even the best drummer in the Beatles, but time and real drummers have rewritten that narrative. Dave Grohl, Nirvana Foo Fighters, once declared, "Ringo is my favorite drummer. He doesn't just keep time, he tells a story with rhythm." Charlie Watts, the Rolling Stones, Phil Collins, Steve Gadd, and dozens of other greats have called him a symbol of modern drumming. Modern Drummer magazine ranked him among the most influential drummers of all time, not for flashy technique, but for intelligence, subtlety, and the uncanny ability to play exactly what the song needed. No more, no less. In a musical world where everyone fights to stand out, Ringo chose to make others shine, and that's exactly what made him irreplaceable. His legacy isn't just etched in Beatles recordings, it lives in the way he never let himself be destroyed by the weight of fame. Since 1989, Ringo Starr and his All-Starr Band has become a touring model of inspiration, where rock legends who once fell from grace come together on stage, not for money or nostalgia, but for friendship and music. He was the first Beatle to publish a photography book, Photograph 2013, wrote a children's book, and has continually reinvented himself with solo albums like Give More Love, 2017, Rewind Forward, 2023, and most recently, Look Up, 2025, a surprise country album that landed in the top 5 of the UK Albums Chart, proving that his music still finds listeners after more than 6 decades. In 2015, Ringo was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, the final Beatle to receive that honor. And in 2018, he was knighted by Prince William for his enduring contributions to popular culture and philanthropy. Most remarkable of all, in a world where so many legends have been lost to tragedy, Lennon, Harrison, Moon, Nilsson, Ringo is still here, sober, cheerful, occasionally poking fun at his age, but still drumming like a boy who just picked up his first pair of sticks. Never obsessed with greatness, he just kept doing what he does best, holding things together. And sometimes, the quiet timekeeper is the one who preserves the memory of an entire generation. Present day. At 84, Ringo Starr still hasn't stopped. While many of his peers have retired, withdrawn into seclusion, or passed on, he continues to show up, healthy, clear-minded, gracious, and never without a smile. Each year on his birthday, July 7th, he hosts a global event with the familiar message, peace and love. All he asks is that people, wherever they are, pause for a minute to think about peace and love. That's enough. No grand speeches, no elaborate stage. He simply stands before a small crowd, raises 2 fingers in a V, and smiles as if hope still has a place in this world. Ringo now lives in Los Angeles with his wife Barbara Bach, the partner who walked with him through the darkness of addiction and into clarity. They are vegetarians, meditate each morning, practice yoga, and tend to their small garden as a way to stay grounded in the real world. He's not disconnected from social media. He posts regularly about tours, albums, photography books, and personal reflections, but he maintains just enough distance to avoid getting swept into the noise of modern life. The music goes on. In 2023, he released the EP Rewind Forward, and in 2025 came Look Up, a country album that surprised many and drew warm praise. He still tours every summer with the All-Starr Band, still sits behind the drums, still sings, with a little help from my friends, like the song was written just yesterday. But what makes Ringo special isn't just endurance. It's the way he has survived and thrived in a world that once tried to define him too narrowly. From a sickly poor boy in Liverpool to the least talented Beatle, to an alcoholic spiraling out of control, Ringo has fallen at nearly every stage of life, and yet each time he got back up, quietly, without blame, without demanding to be celebrated. That's why he, of all people, became the final timekeeper of the Beatles. When everything else has become history, when John and George live on only through recordings, when Paul chooses his appearances carefully, Ringo is still there, drumming steady, kind, unshakable, like a living memory. And perhaps the most remarkable thing he leaves behind isn't a hit song, an album, or a tour. It's a quiet lesson. In a world obsessed with being great, be humble enough to be essential. What about you? Is it the quiet ones in your life, like Ringo once was in the Beatles, who truly keep everything in rhythm? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to follow us for more journeys into the lives of those who seemed small, but carried the strongest, steadiest beat of all,